Okay, this is part 3, and we're going to talk about two theories of intersectionality and hybridity. So first, intersectionality. The term intersectionality was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an American legal scholar, and she discussed the way that multiple structural inequality and discrimination shapes the lives of minority groups, particularly Black women. So her theory starts with feminist theory, and she was her main concern was about Black women. So she talked about different system of discrimination. So she used the analogy of traffic as an intersection to conceptualize the intersectionality theory. She noted that if an accident happens, for example, in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions and sometimes from all of them. So it's not just from one direction. And she gave an example, for example, if an ethnic minority woman experience discrimination, her suffering could result from sex discrimination. It can be from the race discrimination. It can be from class discrimination or other forms of discrimination, but often it raised to their confluences. So it's not just one system of operation. It's not just not just race, or it's not just class, or it's not just gender. Sometimes it's all intersect with each other to cause oppression and discrimination. Another, the first notion at first when the intersectionality was developed, the theory, the notion of triple oppression of class, race, and gender was created to explore experience of women of color. So it was mostly, they call it triple oppression, class, gender, and race. And later, intersectionality developed to include other identities such as sexualities, disability, sometimes immigration status, different identity makers. It became popular methodology first among feminists who acknowledged that differences between women and the inclusion of a minority voices offers an intersectional analysis of dynamic of power relation. So they just start talking about differences between women when talk about sexism or patriarchy. Some scholars like Crenshaw, they argue that there are differences between women, and not all women have the same experience of sexism. So it can be based on their class or based on their race, and other identity makers, they have different experience of sexism. So someone that is, for example, a minority woman from a lower class and is an unemployed woman, her experience of sexism is completely different from a white woman who's a rich woman who's got a job. It's completely different. So there are always differences among one group of people. The same with racial categories. If, for example, not all of the minority women have the same experience of racism. It can be based on their, for example, class or other identity makers' experience are different. Intersectionality opposes the reduction of identity to a single one. You cannot say the inequality is just based on gender or it's just based on race. It's about the deconstruction of binaries and its opposition to the idea that categories of identity are independent. So it's the old idea of binaries, and especially in Western philosophy, we can see this binaries is very common. So she just argue with the theories of intersectionality. There's not just binary of, for example, white or black or women and men. It's always there is the cut across each other, and they have a constitutive effects. And also she talks about intersectionality, about power. Power is seen as differentiated not only between, but also within identity groups. So not all women are equally oppressed, and not all Black people are in the same societal position. As I thought, not all women, white women, are different from the women of color, or Black people, among them is based on their class or gender. It's different. So experience of a Black male of racism is different from a Black woman. So it's all these differences within the group as well as between the groups. So intersectionality moves beyond the additive methods of understanding the gender, class, and race and other types of social disadvantage, and instead prioritize complexity. So it's really interesting with intersectionality that look at the complex, system of oppression and discrimination. It challenged identity politics, group essentialism, and assumption of in-group uniformity. So this assumption that people in one group are all similar, as I mentioned, for example, not all women have the same experience of sexism, and not all immigrants have the same experience of racism. At the same time, it's important to be aware that the concept of intersectionality does not just refer to gender and race, and also it talks about other identity makers and different, as I mentioned first, it was just class, race, and gender, and these days they got other social categorization like nationality, disability, sexuality, immigration status, and all of these aspects has been added to intersectionality theory. So what's the aim of intersectionality? So the great things about intersectionality is that it placed lived experience of marginalized group and their voices at the center of the theory. And that's why it makes it an exceptional theory. And I should say, personally, I love intersectionality because of that. And it talks about the interaction and intersection of agency and social structure that we talk about it in the first few lectures, that are we are have agency to change the environment around us, or are shaped by the social structures. So in intersectionality, they talk about the intersection of both agency and social structure. It looks at the complexity of individuals and group identities, which are socially constructed and changing. So group identities and individual identity are not fixed and static, because we can see based on the social context, it can be changing. The identity of the person, as an immigrant, you may just belong to different groups based on your sexuality, or based on your gender, or based on your class. It's also, intersectionality reveals how social inequality is functioning in power structure. So it's beautifully portrayed how the inequality, different kind of inequality, is just embedded in power structure in the society. And it tries to promote social justice and change. And one of the aim of the intersectionality is just put the voice of marginalized people in the center. So we can see in the most of the theory, it's usually we talk about the founder of sociology, that all of them were male and they were all white. But in intersectionality theory, we just try to give voice to people whose voice have never been heard. So it's one of the beautiful things about intersectionality. Also, there is a connection between immigration and intersectionality. As I said, intersectionality the first time appears in feminist and anti-racist scholarship during 1980s. In several global North countries, women of color and anti-racist feminist scholars and activists try to bring the issue of the racism to the fore, and just try to give epistemic privilege to the most marginalized community. So it started, intersectionality start with women of color and anti-racist scholarship. So it had a deep connection with immigration and people of color. The promise of intersectionality were addressing justice concerns for immigrants as well, and injustice that created during the migration, through the migration process, is rooted in its simultaneous engagement with multiple power relations. That we talk, that is a multiple and complex relationship of power that excludes and silences some group of marginalized people, and just try to just give them voice. So one of the marginalized group in most of the Western countries are immigrants and refugees. So it tried to give voice to this group of marginalized people as well. And the intersectionality perspectives help us to understand the uniqueness of immigrant identities that is stratified by ethnicity, class, and gender, and the specific condition of immigration, as we talk about in the next part. So not all the immigrants are the same, and there's difference between immigrants based on the reason for immigration, and is it the choice, they choose to immigrate, or is the forced immigration like refugees and asylum seeker. So it just try to look at the uniqueness of the experience of each group of immigrant and refugees. Another theory that we just touched base a little bit earlier with Baba's theories is hybridity. And in cultural study, hybridity means multiple identities, crossover, pick and mix, boundary crossing experiences and styles, matching a world of growing migration and diaspora lives, intensive intercultural communication, everyday multiculturalism, and erosion of boundaries. It's similar to intersectionality, but it look at just mostly intercultural communication between different cultures, like the culture of diaspora and the host countries. And in optimistic takes on hybridity, hybrid were conceived as lubricant in the clashes of culture. They were the negotiators who would secure a future free of xenophobia. So we can see that the hybrids try to just respond to the clash of culture, and instead try to focus of the being hybrid and be part of different culture and interconnectedness of the culture, and just try to have a future without any xenophobia and fear. So it's a bit positive. It looks as the positive and hope. Hybridity contests the notion of any pure identity. So there is no pure identities. Pure or focus not on the purity of category, but on the degree of overlap between categories. So it's a category can be anything, overlaps between race or class or culture. So it's an overlap between them, and there is no pure identity. You cannot say if I'm from a pure culture. So each culture is affected and impacted by other cultures. The same as cultural belief, among ethnic groups or cultural groups is the same. It can have interconnectedness with each other. The modern use of the concept of hybridity seeks to argue against the monoculturalist view of identity. So identity is changeable rather than static. So an essential is the same thing that Baba said. So our identity is changeable, and our culture is changing. So it's affected by other culture, as we talk about like second generation or third generation of immigrant, or even people that are born in a country, their culture is keep changing in the interaction with other cultures as well. And hybridity is often linked to globalization process that we talked in the last lectures. Increasing globalization leads to greater hybridization. So we can see that the more we have the globalized world around us, that there is interconnectedness between, cultures and, all of those aspects of social lives, we can see more and more hybridity among cultures and society. Hybridity emphasized the blurry nature of identity work around the notion of ethnicity and the way people may have multiple and shifting ethnic identities depending on the social context. So their identity is based on the social context that they are living in. And social theorist Nestor Garcia links hybridization not just to identity, but the whole culture, noting that human history contains no pure culture. So again, it's the discussion about no pure culture, no pure races, and their own interconnectedness. And especially in the globalized world, we can see more and more, we are getting more and more interconnected. The notion of hybridity emphasized the way in which transnational processes have involved the development of intercultural and cross-cultural lifestyle and practices. So it says there's the move from static and rigid form of ethnicity and move towards demise of identity politics of racism. So if we believe that we have interconnectedness and intercultural lifestyle, there is there is a distance between racism. So we cannot be racist because all of us have a share anyway share part of the cultures and the lifestyle, so there is no excuse for racism. And it may be the case that there is an intermingling of cultural lifestyles and values producing new and innovative form. For example, it's a example of that we cannot just have a pure form of cultural style. Young white adolescents have been seen as synthesis in the culture of the white English background with the new culture of minorities. So we can see that even white adolescents, they are adopting some part of culture of other minority group, or even between minority group we can see there is so many interconnectedness. So it's one of those aspects of hybridity. So it was a brief explanation of these two theories, and in the next part we're going to talk about refugees and asylum seeker and Islamophobia.